Okay, Kevin.
Thanks, Fran. I agree with so much of what Jonathan and Sami have said that I want to skip over talking in the first instance about Syria directly and to place Syria in the context, in some other context, as the meeting title suggests. And the first context is seen more by way of its consequence, which is the agreement, the first stage of an agreement over the Iranian nuclear program which took place in Geneva. This is something whose impact will be felt over the course of the next 6 months and indeed beyond when the talks reconvene. It's something whose impact can be seen on the face and in the consternation of Benjamin Netanyahu in Tel Aviv, who's gone absolutely crazy that the reason, the casus belli that he was looking for a direct military attack upon Iran has been taken, at least temporarily, off the table. And where did this agreement come from? How was it possible for this agreement to take place? It's not an agreement which is permanent and fixed by any means. It came from the decision in late August, early September, the decision by the Western powers under enormous pressure to pull back from what felt like in that bank holiday weekend a drive, an unstoppable drive towards direct military intervention against Syria. The vote inside the British Parliament, which as other speakers have said, went on to impact on the Obama administration. And you know, in March of this year, there was lots of coverage in the media about what did the anti-war movement achieve, what did February 15th of 2003 achieve. Well, just 6 months after that, you can see what the building and sustaining of an anti-war movement in this country did achieve. It contributed directly to the vote inside the British Parliament. People listen to the debate. 37 MPs who spoke cited Iraq and public opinion in this country as to why it was that they would not vote to give Cameron a free hand in the war on so this is the first context. The second context is the shifting balance of power in the world, which again we're only at the beginnings of seeing. The relative decline of US powers. US power still remains overwhelmingly strong. US military expenditure is 75% of NATO's military expenditure. It's equal to the next 21 countries combined. But the US is now no longer determinant in every area of the world, certainly to the extent that it hopes to be. You've got to have to look at two events which are taking place simultaneously this week. In the East China Sea, a very dangerous escalation of rival warplanes in the air, and also the confrontation on the streets of Ukraine, of whether Ukraine will join the European Union or will tilt towards Moscow. These are indications of a rise in China, and also the fact that Russia is no longer, as it was for so many years, under the thumb of the United States, or at least under the thumb of politicians which were prepared to be under the thumb of the United States. The consequence of this is a kind of language of the Cold War that we see. And it's very interesting, isn't it? You know, you see British newspapers saying, how dare China fly warplanes over the East China Sea. Now against anybody flying warplanes, but nobody seems to ask, why are the United States flying its warplanes 12 time zones away from the capital of the United States in Washington? Or that Japan is governed by a man who harks back to the imperial days of Japan in the 1930s and 1940s, or that South Korea is governed by a woman who's the daughter of Park Chung-hee, the dictator of the 1970s. You read an article which says that Ukraine is in danger of suffering an Anschluss, being drawn in by Russia. I'm against anybody expanding. But they say Ukraine should join the European Union, dominated by Germany. That wouldn't be an Anschluss. You know, the European Union, that the national sovereignty of Greece and Cyprus remains fully intact, doesn't it? But it's not being signed off by the bankers and so on. So this is the kind of hypocrisy that we're seeing globally, and it's playing out inside the region of the Middle East and playing out around the question of Syria. The third context is the regional context of the Middle East. The decline of US hegemony has meant that it has been more reliant upon allies to pursue its purpose, and those allies have been Israel, of course, but also Turkey and Saudi Arabia. And this is one of the reasons that there's been an attempt, which I believe is now being drained, to inflame sectarian tension between Sunni and Shia, between Muslim and Christian inside the region. This is not the first time it's happened. Saudis are past masters at this. After the Iranian Revolution in 1979, they needed to contain the influence of revolutionary Islamism in both its Shia and Sunni variants, and you had the pumping out of Wahhabism from Saudi Arabia. Look at the publication statistics in Saudi Arabia. The amount of books published and proselytization for a highly sectarian form of ideology went through the roof in the early 1980s, and it's exactly the same thing happening now, an attempt of a kind of new Sykes-Picot, a new divide between the Arabs and between the peoples of the Middle East more generally. And of course, the United States remains very dependent on these allies. You can look at the figure of $52 billion of arms sales which are about to be released to Saudi Arabia. And there's another context, which is the context of the Arab process, the revolutionary process that began in Tunisia, spread to Egypt, and spread around the region, Yemen, and in the early days to Syria in 2011. There was a deliberate attempt to derail this process in three different ways. The first way to derail this process was quite simple. It was to rally to the traditional and longest-standing allies of the Western powers in the region, principally Saudi Arabia. And what did that mean? It meant the suppression of the Bahraini revolution in rivers of blood which washed onto the Grand Prix tracks of the large companies and Bernie Ecclestone and so on, who behaved as if nothing had happened in Bahrain, and a Western media which still behaves as if nothing happened in Bahrain, and a British Prime Minister who used the opportunity of a visit to the Gulf to sell and reopen the arms trade to Bahrain. That's the first way that they did it. The second way that they did it was to pretend that in some way they were on the side of the revolutionary process. This is what they did in Libya. Well, nobody talks about Libya now. Nobody talks about Libya. Do you remember how many thousand were going to die in Benghazi? We don't know how many might have died in Benghazi. We do know that the town of Twerga has been wiped off the map in Libya, that the fragmentation of the country, politically, geographically, along all sorts of lines, is running deeper and deeper, where it's not direct Western control of the oil fields, it's one or other militia which is trying to exploit the oil in order to enrich itself and not enrich the Libyan people. The third way was to seek to subvert the political forces in Egypt and in other countries and in Syria in order to corral them along lines which would not confront Western hegemony, in exactly the way that Sami said. This is the context of the attempts to derail the process, attempts which unfortunately have been overwhelmingly successful in Syria. Now, it's always possible, and there always are people in such conflicts, in the multifaceted civil war in Syria, as there were in the wars of succession following the collapse of Yugoslavia, people who are attempting to resist the sectarianism, resist the bloodshed, and look to both fighting for progress and to fight against imperial domination. But what are the dominant forces inside Syria? Unfortunately, they're not those forces, and with every push for Western intervention, with every dollar spent by Prince Bandar in Saudi Arabia, those forces are weaker, and the prospects of a progressive transformation which stands up to the West and stands for the Syrian people in Syria is put further and further back. Now, the final thing I want to say is really about our movement, there are, not just about our movement, but about this whole debate, there are two aspects of this debate. The first is a debate between the international anti-war movement, and this is a gathering of the international anti-war movement, and those who are actually in favour of war, in favour of Western intervention, and in favour of the spread of Western suzerainty throughout the Middle East. Just as Ahmed Shalabi, as Sami mentioned, was in favour of that. There's not so much a debate, there's an outright argument between an anti-war movement and people such as the bulk of the Tory party in the Parliament who pushed for war, and those inside the United States who pushed for war, and Israel and all of the other forces. There's an outright argument. Amongst ourselves as an anti-war movement, there are differences of assessment. Some people may believe that the potential for genuine revolutionary transformation inside Syria is greater than what the panel here believe. That's a perfectly legitimate difference of assessment. But we need, in that difference of assessment, to understand what unites us and to understand how it is that we conduct that debate. I'm not talking about a debate with those who are on the other side, by the way, that's an outright argument. But how it is we conduct a debate. Those of us who say that the key is to stand up against the United States imperialism and against our own government are not Assad apologists. Those who place greater emphasis upon what they hope to be a progressive process in Syria are not apologists for imperialism, if they're within this movement. What guides us, what unites us, is the fact that we are in London. We are in a situation where declining Western powers are still accelerating towards war in different parts of the world, be it the East China Sea, be it the Central African Republic, be it French troops in Mali, be it the fact that they've not given up upon controlling the Middle East, even if they need to pivot their forces further east. And in that context, as we approach the anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War next year, let's remember the words which carried over the blood-filled trenches of Europe, that came from Germany in 1916, that in countries such as ours, in circumstances such as this, der Hauptfeind steht im eigenen Land. The main enemy is at home. Just like Sami, I object to the childlike attempts to reduce political forces and reduce major events to the name of an individual. And it's always interesting, isn't it, as to who it is that they target in order to demonise, as if one whole country, or indeed one whole side of the country, indeed, if one whole side of the country, we had the Mahdi, we had Mussolini on the Nile in the case of Nasser. Now, I think it's important for us to reflect on where things are going, and therefore where the anti-war movement is going. See, the brother asked about Turkey. I haven't got time to go into it. But one positive, absolutely. I'm just recognising the point, and we can discuss it after the plenary, because we need to move straight on to it. But one important development from this is that there is now, far from there being the push towards further war between the Turkish state and the Islamic Republic of Iran, there's some tentative signs of de-escalating that. Now, this is not, for me, the totality of change that I want to see in the Middle East. Part of my family is from Iran. I want to see much bigger changes than that, but I certainly don't want to see Ankara and Tehran as major armed powers at war inside the Middle East. And this is a good thing. It's a good thing that things move in that direction. Secondly, this sectarian poison. I've just come from a meeting about Palestine, a very important conference in Beirut. We're in London. People should know that in the region, people are trying to drain this poison, right? They're trying to locate the areas of disagreement, but prevent them from spreading into the kind of fitna, division, which was implemented through Sykes-Picot, and now there's a further attempt to implement it. So you had all of the Palestinian factions. You had Hezbollah and Hamas sat in a room together to talk about how do we re-raise Palestine to make that the central issue inside the Middle East, rather than talk about Iran, talk about Syria, talk about Moscow, talk about anything except the dispossession of the Palestinian people. This is an important step forward in time. And I tell you, if people, and some of us here have friends in the region who've been killed on, in my case, both sides of the conflict in Syria, if people who've suffered that can look to how it is that they can contain those disagreements and look to restoring a progressive path, then it ill behoves us in London to escalate the division at the time when people inside the region are attempting to get back on the right track. And finally, people say, what is the solution? I don't believe the solution is a reconfiguration of the United Nations. I believe that the solution is what was identified in 2003 as the second potential world power. And we saw that on the streets of Cairo. We saw that in Tahrir. We saw it. And it's returning, despite the attempts by people to divert it in Egypt, in London and elsewhere. There are demonstrations taking place now in Egypt. There are people who want to see the Arab and peoples of the Middle East finally determine their own future. And those people exist in Syria. They oppose dictatorship in Syria. They oppose imperialist intervention in Syria, they want to reclaim Jolan, and they look to people here to behave accordingly to support that struggle.